Thank you, Hannes. So as Hannes mentioned, in terms of the logistics, we have a 1.5 hour slot, roughly, with a 5 to 10 minute comfort break built in right at the end. So Steph, I was told that when you're roughly 20 minutes before the end, I will offer you, if you would like to have a Q&A session with the audience, but it's really up to our speaker. So I shall give a very brief introduction to our first speaker for today, who is Dr. Steph Rennick. Steph is a philosopher at the University of Glasgow. She is currently a researcher on the Swiss National Science Foundation funded project entitled Being Without Foundations, having previously worked as a lecturer at the Universities of Glasgow and Cardiff. Part of Steph's work is located at the intersection of philosophy and pop culture, where she aims to foster a bi-directional exchange between academics and the creators and consumers of speculative fiction across different media. To this end, she runs the website The Epicurean Cure and is working with a linguist on improving conversations in video games. Steph has appeared on BBC Radio and various podcasts and is a firm believer in making philosophy engaging and accessible. Steph's talk today is entitled A Philosopher's Guide to Time Travel. We very much look forward to it, Steph. Over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just hiding the videos for a sec, so let me just make sure. Okay. Just so I can see my screen. I really am delighted to be here. Saying that I am committed to making philosophy engaging and accessible might sound like a big task. I hope I live up to it for you today, and I hope you enjoy it. I was going to do a kind of poll, but actually I can't see you all because of the webinar format. So maybe as part of the Q&A, you can tell us what some of your favorite time travel texts are. When I say time travel text, I just mean any kind of film or TV show or video game or book or webcomic or poem or whatever you like. So we get a sense of that as we go along. Okay, so what to expect today? To start with, I'm going to say just a little bit about myself and a little bit about what we have in mind when we talk about time travel. And then for the bulk of the talk, and I'm only going to talk for about 40 minutes because I think it's really important that people can ask as many questions as they like, and that the direction of the conversation follows people's interests. But the two main things I'm going to talk about are chosen because the kinds of questions that I tend to be asked when I tell people what kind of job I do. So my research interests include things like causal loops, time travel and free will, all the different ways knowing our own future might affect us. And I'm happy to answer questions about any of those in the Q&A. But what I'm going to talk about today is a bit more foundational than that. So the first question that people tend to ask me is, what makes a good time travel story? Or which kind of stories get my seal of approval, if you like? And I'm going to answer that in terms of why you can't change the past, why I think some of the best texts adopt a theory of time under which you can't change the past. And the second question is, yeah, but how can I change the past? Or are there theories of time under which I can? Is there a philosophically consistent way to tell a time travel story that allows me to change the past? So I'm going to answer two questions. One, why you can't change the past, and two, how you can change the past. And then we'll go to the Q&A. I should say, in terms of spoilers, obviously there have been some very recent time travel films and stories, which I'm not going to talk about, although if you've got questions about them, I'll do my best to answer them. I just don't want to spoil them for the audience en masse. So I'm mostly going to talk about films and games and things that are a bit older. Okay, so I'm Steph, I'm a philosopher. And mostly I'm known for my work on time, although as Ferrybird very kindly introduced me, I do other things as well. The voice is Australian, in case you're wondering, and I run a website called The Epicurean Cure, which is located at the intersection of academia and pop culture generally. And my particular interest is the intersection of metaphysics and pop culture. So metaphysics is the study of what's real and what's possible. My hope in terms of what you'll get from this today is an enriched enjoyment and perhaps understanding of time travel texts when you sit down to watch the latest episode of Doctor Who or a film or whatever. More broadly, I hope that my work helps motivate new stories. So by pointing out patterns, the sorts of stories we tend to get told, or the sorts of problems that we tend to encounter, that people will transcend those tropes and go on to give me new games to play and new films to watch. And this talk is part of an ongoing project where I want to write a book called The Philosopher's Field Guide to Time Travel for the general public, which goes over quite a lot of the various issues in my research. But today, as I say, I'm just going to talk about these two foundational ones, these ideas around changing the past. Okay, but first, why should we worry about time travel? You might think it's fairly obvious why we should do ethics, or why we should do political philosophy, or why metaphysicians should try to investigate what the world is really like, or why epistemologists should study how we know things and what the right standard for evidence is, and so on. But you might wonder why a sci-fi idea is worth our consideration. I hope you don't wonder that. I hope you're here because you like time travel already. Nonetheless, I think there are lots of reasons to do this, but here are three of them. The first is that we're fascinated by it. We have countless films and video games and stories and comics and so on devoted to the subject of time travel. And insofar as it's a cultural artifact, I think it's worth us thinking about. Secondly, the reason I spend time thinking about time travel is that it can shine a light on other important philosophical problems. I find time travel a really useful lens for thinking about free will, foreknowledge, coincidence, and so on. And the third is that we're time traveling right now at a rate of 1 second per second into the future. It's not the most exciting time travel, but we should probably understand what it is that we're doing. This is nicely illustrated in this comic from XKCD, where one stick figure says, "I've traveled here from the year 1983 to say this. Are there any bagels left?" Where the idea is that she was born in 1983, and like you attending my talk today, you've all time traveled from the moment that you were born to here, with a whole bunch of intervening stops along the way. While it's technically true, says the comic, I wish she'd stop prefacing every sentence with that. Okay. So even though we might think that talking about time travel is important, there are different things we might mean by time travel. I mean the sort of thing that we see in Doctor Who or Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban or Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I mean the sort of time travel that we see in fiction. But even then, there's a few different things that we might mean. There are different modes or types of time travel. The first is sometimes called continuous time travel. So the idea is that just like when you get in your car and you drive from place to place, you don't cease to exist, right? Your car is there and is part of the movement. So too, continuous time travel is when the time traveler gets in the time machine and moves from time to time, but doesn't just disappear, right? Time maybe rewinds around them or speeds up for them in the time machine, but they continue to exist. And we see this depicted in something like Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, where Harry and Hermione stand in the hospital wing, and around them you see the flickers as time is moving. The second, and it's the kind that I always assume is going on, unless I have clues to the contrary, because I think it comes with the least problems, is discontinuous time travel, which is analogous to teleportation. So the time traveler gets in their time machine, disappears at one moment in time, and reappears at another moment in time. And we see this in films like The Terminator. Thirdly, alternate path time travel. So that's where you get wormholes or ways where the time machine doesn't disappear and reappear, but takes some different path than the usual timeline to get from time to time. And we see this depicted in Doctor Who. And finally, and perhaps most problematically, but becoming more and more popular, is this idea of mental time travel, where instead of the body of the time traveler being the thing that travels through time, just their consciousness does, sometimes to their earlier self, sometimes into some other body. We see this in X-Men Days of Future Past, in the Netflix series Travelers, and others. Okay, so we might have any of those things in mind. In the examples I'll give, I will, as I say, assume that we're talking about discontinuous travel, but if you want to ask questions about any of the others, please do. And everything I say about changing the past should apply to all of them. Okay. When I think about time and time travel, I'm not strictly concerned with the physics. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a philosopher of physics. I'm interested in what we call logical possibility. So the idea is that even if the world was quite different than what we take it to be, even if the laws of physics were quite different, what would be possible? right? And there are going to be some things that are still impossible no matter what the laws of physics are like, and I'm interested in those boundaries. Although it is the case that some films and shows and games are concerned with physics, and we might want our fiction to be compatible with our best scientific theories. That's okay. It does mean if you ask me questions about complicated physics, I probably won't be able to answer them. Apologies. Okay, philosophers recognize various theories of time. There are lots of different candidates for what might be the right theory of time. But so do we in our everyday talk. So often we talk, and this is culturally relative, it varies between cultures, but often we here in the UK talk about time as if the present is what is existing and where all the live stuff happens, that the future hasn't happened yet, it doesn't exist yet, it's before us, and the past is behind us and it's over and it's closed and maybe it doesn't exist anymore. So we can make sense of talk like that, but we can also watch a time travel film, say, where a time traveler moves about to different times and all of those exist simultaneously, or they all exist, and we're okay with that too. So our common sense talk can vary in terms of how we talk about time. Likewise, different texts will operate under different theories of time. But because they might do this more or less consistently, and because fiction is sometimes ahead of us in our ivory towers, time travel media doesn't always neatly map onto philosophical theories. With some texts I can say, ah, yes, that's presentism, or oh, yes, that's a growing block. But with others, it's not so clear. Nonetheless, we can divide things into two basic categories. We can divide our stories under this dichotomy of dynamic versus static. So dynamic stories are the ones where time travelers change things, right? They go back in time and they make things different in some way. Static timelines, by contrast, will only have one timeline, and the time travelers will bring about what they remember or realize that they're playing a role that they played all along. I'm going to talk more about static timelines, but just to give you some examples of the sort of thing I mean, if we talk about films, Back to the Future 2 has this dynamic picture where Marty and Doc are changing things, and so does Looper. Static, by contrast, we see in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, in 12 Monkeys, and I contend in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. It's not just films that we see this dichotomy. In games, we see it too. So for instance, in Dragon Age Inquisition, the player character gets to see different versions of the future. And likewise in the old LucasArts game, Day of the Tentacle. By contrast, we see this static timeline in Jak 2. So I think that, generally speaking, the best time travel fiction takes place in a static universe. And we usually cash this out. The most common way to cash this out is in terms of a theory of time called four-dimensionalism or eternalism. Here's the theory in brief. So the first thing you need to know about four-dimensionalism is that all times are equally real. So I'm speaking to you from Glasgow today, and Australia is spatially far away from me here in Glasgow, but equally real as Glasgow. Likewise, the future and the past are temporarily far away from us here right now, but equally real. So they're places the time traveler can visit. Secondly, events only happen once. You can't change how or whether something happened after the fact, or ever actually, depending on how we think about change. So if I was to have a time machine and go back in time to 1920, it won't be the case that there was a 1920 the way it was before I ever visited in the time machine, and then a different 1920, same moment in time, where things are different because I'm there in my time machine. If I was ever to go in my time machine to 1920, it's timelessly true that I was there in 1920. We'll speak a little bit more about this. One of the weird ramifications of it is that I can do things before I'm born, but you know, that's time travel for you. And finally, why it's called four-dimensionalism is because it posits four dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. And we're used to thinking of ourselves as being extended in 3 dimensions. We have height or length, width and breadth. Under four-dimensionalism, we also have duration, right? We're stretched out through time in the same way we're stretched out through space. H.G. Wells's time traveler from the Time Machine speaks about a cube and says, a cube extended in these 4 dimensions, and says a cube that lasts no time at all, but isn't extended through time, doesn't exist. So those are the kind of three things you need to know about four-dimensionalism to make sense of it. And the majority of philosophers of time belong in this camp, certainly more than half. The vast majority of the philosophers of time travel, and as you can imagine, there are far fewer of those, belong in this camp. Okay. So, as I said before, the best time travel fiction takes place in a static universe. So one in which those three things are true, that we're extended in 4 dimensions, that times only happen once, and that all times are equally real. And conveniently, and maybe this is partly why I think this is true, is also the kind of universe that many philosophers of time think we're living in. One motivation for adopting this kind of theory is in response to perhaps the most famous challenge to the logical possibility of time travel, which many of you will have heard of, the grandfather paradox. And the grandfather paradox goes like this. If I could travel back in time, I could kill my grandfather before my father was conceived, thereby preventing my own existence. But if I wasn't born, how could I travel back in time to kill my grandfather? From this, it's thought a contradiction ensues. I both can and can't kill my grandfather. I can because killing someone, given the requisite time machine, skills, training, and opportunity, is unfortunately the sort of thing we can usually do. But I can't because if I did, I wouldn't exist. Now, contradictions are bad, right? No matter what your laws of physics are, we don't want contradictions. They're impossibilities. So if time travel were to lead to such a thing, to lead to a contradiction, to lead to a paradox, that would suggest that time travel wasn't possible. And indeed, for a long time, the grandfather paradox was cited as evidence for the impossibility of time travel. As David Lewis, who is my favorite philosopher, and who, if I had a time machine, I would use it to go back and visit, writes, if a time traveler visiting the past both could and couldn't do something that would change it, then there could not possibly be such a time traveler. But many of our fictional heroes seem to be just such travelers. Indeed, many of our fictional heroes, even in some of the texts I mentioned as being static, seem to be those kind of heroes. They're out to change the past. And so you might wonder, well, according to philosophy, according to this dominant view, are all these just nonsense? After all, we get to see things happening twice, it seems. We see the original set of events, or read about it, or hear about it, those that the time traveler wishes to change. And then we see the new set of events where an apparent change has occurred. And if that's the right interpretation, if that's what's happening in the text, then at the very same moment in time, the event both occurs and doesn't occur. That's a contradiction, and we can't have those. So for instance, in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, without spoiling any of the major details, although it's an old book and film, I'd be surprised. Harry and Hermione travel back in time. Part of their reason for doing so is to save the hippogriff Buckbeak from being executed. So one way to interpret the events of the film and the book is that originally, in the original timeline, Buckbeak was executed. And then in the time travel version of the timeline, Buckbeak wasn't. If that's right, then we have a contradiction akin to the grandfather paradox, right, where something has both happened and not happened. And that would suggest that that time travel is impossible. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. One thing to say, just in terms of terminology, we call these attempts to change the past and thereby generate a contradiction bilking attempts. That's the word for them in time travel philosophy. And in order to avoid contradictions, in order to avoid genuine paradoxes, either time travel must not occur or bilking attempts must fail. After all, if one succeeded, it would lead to a contradiction, and contradictions are impossible. Now, we want time travel to be able to occur. We want these stories to be philosophically consistent, so we need an explanation for the failure of these bilking attempts. Conceiving of time as static, which mostly means conceiving it as 4-dimensional, is the most common way to overcome this problem. And we see this in, for instance, films like 12 Monkeys. And I don't mean the Netflix series that came out recently called 12 Monkeys, because it takes a dynamic picture and is disappointing, but the film is excellent. And in 12 Monkeys, Bruce Willis's character is intending to go back in time and change the past. That's the whole conceit of the film. But he realizes at the end, spoiler, that a scene that he remembers from his youth, seeing this man in sunglasses wielding a gun, is actually his future. So he is the man in the sunglasses wielding the gun. So he hasn't actually changed anything, right? The timeline is consistent. And in Harry Potter, I think the best way to understand what's going on in that film, especially given all the other cues and what's going on in the novel, is that Buckbeak isn't killed and then not killed. Because Harry and Hermione traveled in time, he was never killed, and they always traveled in time. When they hear the swish and thud of the axe, they later see that the executioner hit the pumpkin rather than the hippogriff. Okay, so how does this help? I've given you some examples, but how does a static timeline actually help us get around this? Well, the idea is, should a time traveler decide to travel in time and perform some action, which in philosophy we use the Greek letter phi to represent, so that can be any action, going back in time and convincing your grandma not to take up smoking, to give your younger self the winning lottery numbers, to kill your grandfather. Should a time traveler decide to travel in time and do that action, he has already been there and done so. I've used he deliberately because unfortunately most time travelers tend to be male. It's very disappointing. Okay. But to think this, to think otherwise, that is, to think that there can be a first version and then this revised version is to commit what's called the second time around fallacy. And this is a common mistake. To make this mistake, writes Heather Dyke, is to move from the fact that the events of a time are recounted twice and recounted from two different perspectives to the conclusion that events happen twice. From this, it is thought to follow that it is possible for the events to turn out differently each time they occur. But that's just perspective, right? That's not how events actually come about. Now, that's not to say you don't have an effect. Sometimes when I say things like this, people worry that if they were to get into their time machine and go to 1920, they'd be some kind of ghost, being able to witness the events but not really interact with them. That's not the case. You just being there makes a difference from how it would have been had you not been there. But it's not the case that there was a time in which you weren't and then a time in which you were. The way that 1920 was always included you, and subsequent events came about as they did because you were there. But that's not a change between two successive actualities, rather a change between a potentiality and an actuality. So in short, and this is my favorite meme to sum this up, I don't always time travel to the past, but when I do, I did. And we see this really nicely in the original Bill and Ted film. They really make the most of the immutability or the static nature of the timeline. So you see this exchange. Can we get your dad's keys? Oh, could steal them, but you lost them 2 days ago. If only we could go back in time to when he had them and steal them. Well, why can't we? Because we don't got time. We could do it after the report. Ted, good thinking, dude. After the report, we'll travel back to 2 days ago, steal your dad's keys, and leave them here. Where? I don't know. How about behind that sign? That way, when we get here now, they'll be waiting for us. Bends down and picks up the keys. See? So Bill and Ted are taking full advantage of the fact that things only happen once. And we understand when watching the film that it's not that Ted's dad lost his keys, right? And thus they have to find some time before he lost them. But rather, his losing them was really just them stealing them all along. We see quite a lot of texts that take advantage of a static timeline and thus get my seal of approval. So at least as far as this bit is concerned. The first Terminator film, not the sequels. Sequels tend to go off the rails in terms of time travel. This is a pattern I've noticed lately. There's a film called Predestination, which is an adaptation of Robert Heinlein's All You Zombies, which has other problems, but as far as the time travel is concerned, does really interesting things. Doctor Who works with the rule of fun. It just does whatever works to tell the best story. But there's an episode called Blink, which is where the Weeping Angels are first introduced, that does beautiful things with a static timeline and really interesting things with causal loops. So that's worth checking out. And likewise, we see this sort of static picture in Game of Thrones with Bran's visions. Okay, so I think that a static timeline, a four-dimensional picture, is the best way to tell philosophically consistent time travel fiction. But that only covers a pretty small range of the time travel stories we might want to tell. And so people ask me, well, yeah, but how could I change the past? Or is there a philosophically consistent way to tell a time travel story in which the time travelers really do change things? And the answer is yes, there's a few ways to do it. But number one, you still have to watch out for paradoxes. You still have to avoid contradictions. So what we need is some sort of mechanism, some sort of metaphysics, the right theory of time that allows for people to change things without it being the case that something is simultaneously true and false, or that an event both occurs and doesn't occur, because that would be a contradiction. And there are some possibilities. I'm going to discuss 3 of them. And what really matters for these stories is picking and sticking to a theory of time. So we might take a sort of branching account of time. We might take a transdimensional picture. Or my favorite, not because I think it's the way that the universe really is, but I think it best captures our intuitions about time travel for certain kinds of stories, is a modified growing block. So I'm going to talk through these, the first 2 very quickly, and then the third one in a little bit more detail. So when I talked about four-dimensionalism, we can envisage time as a line, right? And the time travelers move about on that line. Usually the rest of us just kind of plod forward one step at a time, but the time travelers can move about and zigzag across the line. Branching time, by contrast, looks more like a tree. So perhaps at moments of choice, or moments where the time traveler comes back in time and intervenes, or there are various reasons for the different nodes, each of those spells off to a different branch. So here's a simplified picture of this. H1, H2, H3 stands for hypertime, so those are just our branches, and T1 and T2 are moments across the branches where we have these changes happen, or these splitting offs happen. So imagine that our time traveler is born at the bottom of H1, at the bottom of the tree, and grows up and gets a time machine 2/3 of the way up the tree, and then gets in the time machine and goes back to T1. And then at that point is on this other branch, is on H2. A couple of things to note here. The first is that if the story is consistent, then each branch is individually going to be static. So it's not going to be the case that in a given branch, the time traveler both kills and doesn't kill their grandfather, or that the time traveler both is and isn't born. But what might happen is that in branch 1, the grandfather procreates and eventually the time traveler is born and they grow up and they travel in time. But in the second branch, the time traveler comes back and prevents that branch's version of themselves being born, or kills that branch's version of their grandfather. Just what I've said might be a reason why this is slightly dissatisfying, depending on what you want out of your time travel. It's never going to be the case that you're changing the future or past within a branch, because that would lead to contradictions or paradoxes. So it's going to be doppelganger or alternate branch grandfather that you kill. Nonetheless, we see this kind of branching picture in quite a lot of texts. So for instance, in Back to the Future 2, I think this is the charitable interpretation of what's going on with all these different timelines. And we also see it very explicitly in the new Star Trek films. But it's not just films or visual media. We get it in Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and also Final Fantasy 13-2 has these different branches, these different ways that the future went. Okay, so that's one way we can change the past. The second is if we have a transdimensional picture. And this works much like branching, except between dimensions. So we see something like this in BioShock Infinite. And not all transdimensional travel is necessarily travel through time. So there are shows like Sliders where people move through a portal and they're in a different world that is in some sense similar to ours, but is in some sense different. We could nonetheless tell a more tightly time travel-y type story by having different temporal dimensions. So having people move along different timelines. Although depending on how we cash that out, it does get very close to a branching model. Some limitations of this kind of approach is that firstly, we might wonder whether it's really time travel, whether traveling between worlds or whether traveling between dimensions really counts as time travel in the full-blooded way that we might have in mind. The second is, just like the branching account, just like four-dimensionalism, we're not ever really changing the past. Because what you're doing is making it the case that a different dimensional grandfather is dead. But it's never going to be the case that different dimensional grandfather was both alive and dead at the same time. Nonetheless, stories that take this kind of approach allow us to see different pasts and multiple futures. And we might think that's enough, that that's what we're interested in. But that doesn't exhaust the philosophical canon. That's not the only options available. And thus, I want to talk a little bit about the growing block. Now, not very many philosophers, there's a few that defend the growing block, but not very many think that this is the right theory of time. And I don't know anybody that defends this modified growing block that I'm going to tell you about as the right theory of time. Nonetheless, as far as fiction goes, it's a good one. And part of why is that I think it best captures this idea that we sometimes have when we watch time travel films, as if the time travelers are getting to rewind the past and re-record something new, that they have this power to really change things, not to change different branch versions of themselves or different dimensional versions of themselves, but somehow the actual past. And we get this particularly in disaster type time travel films where the time traveler doesn't want to just find the best future for themselves. They want to fix the broken, bad future for everybody else. Okay, so first you need to know what a standard growing block says. The standard growing block, according to Sarah Bernstein, holds that the past and present are real. So under four-dimensionalism, I said the past, the present, and the future are all equally real. There are other accounts like presentism, which hold that just the present is real. The past no longer exists, the future doesn't exist yet. The growing block is sort of a mixture of the two. It holds that the past and the present are real, and the present moves. The growing blockist shares the eternalist or the four-dimensionalist's belief in the reality of the past, but stipulates that the present is the growing edge of being. With every passing moment, the total amount of being expands. The growing block holds that the objective present corresponds with the forward-moving bleeding edge of existence. So it looks a bit like this, right? The universe from the Big Bang onwards to now might be this big, and then we add on blocks as time moves forward. Now, time travel in a standard growing block is at best tricksy, to quote Gollum, and at worst impossible. But Peter van Inwagen, who's up in the top corner, proposes a different model of time travel, given a sort of slightly modified growing block, in which it is possible to change the past. And this is Bernstein's description. She writes, a time traveler relocates herself to an earlier temporal location in the existing block, annihilating those pieces of the block between her temporal point of departure and her arrival. And as I say, I think this best captures this idea that we can just rewind the tape and re-record. So to see what this looks like, for those of you who can't see the picture, there's a stack of Lego blocks with a dark green block at the bottom. We can imagine the universe being like this. So dark green block is the Big Bang, and then successive moments are these extra Lego blocks that's added to what exists. And then the time traveler at the top gets in the time machine and returns to the middle of the Lego stack. And everything after that point then disappears. It's ready for rewriting. And then, if you'll excuse my dodgy Lego block drawings, a different type of future then emerges from that point because of the decisions and the actions of the time traveler. Now that looks great in that it captures this rewinding idea. It captures this idea of really being able to change how things turn out. So it allows you to change the past and future. It gets that tick in its column. It also allows us to explain this trope that we find in quite a lot of time travel fiction, where the time traveler or time travelers can remember the old future, even though no one else can, right? They bear the burden of having survived the bad time to bring about the good time. We can overcome the worry about contradictions. Peter van Inwagen allows us to do this by this idea called hypertime, which, I mean, don't worry about that too much. If you would like me to talk about it, I'm more than happy to answer questions about it in the question time. But the idea is that you kind of have a record. It's not really temporal, but you have some kind of record of the way things were and this new version, which is the way things are. So it's not going to be the case that in the same hypertime that things both are and aren't a given way. Okay, but there are a few worries with this account. And this is something that we see generally, right? Every theory of time comes with its own strengths and its own limitations, and those limitations need to be taken seriously. So here's a few worries. Firstly, the time traveler returning to the past wipes out their own causal history. So if the time traveler is going back in time to save their loved one, then the intervening memories they have with their loved one are wiped off the face of the map. They might hold on to them, but they don't kind of exist in the world anymore. If the time traveler goes back in time to before they were born, then their birth and their growing up and all the different things that led to them getting in the time machine, that disappears too. Some people are more or less worried about that. Secondly, the time machine needs mega powers. So generally speaking, our time machines in a static universe are kind of like a pimped up car. So our car allows us to traverse space, so too our time machine allows us to move around in time. Under this growing block account though, the time machine has destroying or creative powers. So if the time traveler goes back in time, they wipe out the period of time between their departure and their arrival. So the time machine kind of erases that to allow this new history to take place. If they go to the future, say the time traveler travels 20 years into the future, then under the growing block, remember that 20 years doesn't exist yet, but by the time they get there, it must. So the time machine somehow must write that future or enable that future to work, and it's not entirely clear what that would be like for the people living in that 20-year period. Thirdly, what if there are two time machines? So what if I get in my time machine and go 10 years into the past, and you get in your time machine and go 20 years into the past? Do you just wipe me out? Which time machine takes precedence? What if there are 100 time machines? And fourthly, and most significantly, there's the genocide. So when you go back in time and you wipe everything out, you wipe out everyone that lives in those times. All the times that they've loved and cried, the people that were born, the people that died, they're all gone. And, you know, depending on your fiction, that's more or less of an issue. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up because I really do want to hear your questions, and I think that that is an interesting way to take this discussion. But a couple of things to end, to keep in mind the next time you settle down to a time travel story, and especially when you're considering if it's any good or if it hangs together. So 2 top tips. The first is be aware of the limitations of a theory of time. As I've said, each theory has its strengths and limitations. The static view allows us to easily tell these beautifully consistent time travel stories, but they're not going to allow us to robustly change the past in the way that we might want to. On the other side of the scale, the growing block plus will allow you to change the past, provided you can get the mega universe destroying time machine. But the cost is bloody. And when you're sitting down and watching something or playing a game with time travel or reading a story with time travel, do consider, you know, what theory of time is in operation here and what ramifications does it have? And are those ramifications being taken seriously? And is the theory of time being treated consistently? Because one of the biggest issues I have with dynamic texts is that more often than not, they aren't treated consistently. We get time travelers having abilities that nonetheless lead to contradictions. And we kind of move what theory is in operation, depending on the place in the story. And the second is keep an eye out for paradoxes. So I just mentioned the grandfather paradox, but there are others. So keep an eye out for impossibilities. Keep an eye out for contradictions, things where something both happens and doesn't happen, or something is both true and not true. Some things to consider when keeping an eye out for this is, does the past change? Do characters attempt to change the past only to discover that they've already done it, or in doing so, bring it about? Because in that case, it's probably static. And finally, some recommendations, and I'm not recommending these because I think they're brilliant or that they do everything right. I'm recommending them because they each do something interesting with time and allow you to flex this new knowledge that I hope you've gotten. The first is Arrival, which is fantastic and well worth watching. The second is Edge of Tomorrow, which does some interesting things with change. The third is season 1 of Netflix's Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, which does some really interesting things in a static picture. And finally, season 2 of Star Trek's Discovery, in which I think the most charitable interpretation is that the time travel works one way and the characters don't all fully understand the way that it works. But all of those are interesting, and I'm sure you have many more recommendations, which I look forward to hearing. Okay, oh, my computer's frozen. All right, that's me. If this has piqued your interest, if you want to hear more about time travel, please check out the Epicurean Cure. Otherwise, I look forward to hearing your questions.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Steph. I think we have too many questions. We're trying to really sort out everything you've been through with us. But perhaps if I could go to the first one, if you could, during your presentation, you said about hypertime, if we wanted to know more. Perhaps you could expand on hypertime?
Oh, sure. Okay, so hypertime is a bit like a log of the way that time has gone in the universe. So imagine that if we've got our Lego blocks, that the one on the bottom gets is time 1, but it's also hypertime 1. And which is like the log of what's going to happen. And then we might have hypertime 2, time 2, hypertime 3, time 3. But imagine that at time 3, the time traveler goes back to time 1 and changes it. Then we get T1 again, but we're at H4 this time, hypertime 4, hypertime 5, hypertime 6. So hypertime is not supposed to be, under Van and Wagen's model, actual time. It's more just like a sort of log or an index of which times happened when and how many times have we seen that moment. So the idea is supposed to be that something is not both true and false at a given hypertime. So it might be the case that at T1 you didn't kill your grandfather, but the second time you had T1 you did, but that's hypertime 1 T1 versus hypertime 4 T1. There are some issues with hypertime. People worry that if you think of it in a kind of full-blooded way, it just ends up being a branching model. And if you don't think of it in a full-blooded way, then it's not really clear that all the causal stuff that goes into being the time traveler, like why the time traveler exists, whether they're the same person, whether hypertime allows for enough continuity between the different T1s, if you like. So, but that's how it works. Is that clear enough?
That's great. If there are any further questions on it, they will come through in the Q&A. Lovely. If I could move on to the next question. There are a couple of questions on free will. The first one goes, what do you think of free will in time travel? Don't most of these stories essentially require a lack of this free will?
Excellent.
Is that a problem for you?
It's not a problem for me, but I totally understand the intuition. So people worry that if I were to go back in time, and if it's the case, well, people's worries come in different ways. So you can let me know in the Q&A if I don't capture one of the ways in which you're worried. But one worry people have is, well, if times are already all real, if the future is somehow real and there are truths about it, doesn't that mean that I have to do the things that it will turn out that I do? So if it's true now that I'm going to eat toast on Friday for breakfast, aren't I somehow fated to eat toast on Friday? Other people worry that when they go back in time, similarly, there are ways the past was, and if I am forced to kind of make the past go that way, then somehow I don't have freedom of choice. I totally understand the intuition, but I think it stems from a misunderstanding. And this is it. So right now, I ate an oat bar for breakfast this morning. Now, at the moment that I chose the oat bar, I didn't have to. I did because I'm a celiac and breakfast options are limited, but I could have had a dry piece of gluten-free toast. The choice was open to me. Nothing has changed, in fact, between when I made that choice this morning and now. It might be already true now that I will eat an oat bar again for breakfast tomorrow, but I don't have to. There's a difference between something that is necessarily true and something that is contingently true. So the reason it's true is because of the choices I will make, not because I had to make those choices. So it's the order of explanation that's in question here. So rather than thinking, oh, well, if I time travel to 1920, that means I have to do certain things. It's like, no, you do those things, and thus 1920 is the way that it is. If you weren't going to do those things, then it would have been different, and that's okay. People might want to follow up on that, but that's the kind of general thrust.
Lovely, thank you. If people want to follow up, they'll just follow it up in the Q&A. Thank you. That question was from Hannes, our host. The next question, and this is related, and you will probably think that you have responded to this. This was relating to free will as well. From Stephen, he says, can you talk about how free will operates in your static view of time travel? Have you described this in the static view just now?
Well, no, because it depends. So views of time come apart from views of free will. So there are lots of different views of free will in philosophy. So people think that free will comes about from having choice, or they think that free will comes when you have the right kind of ownership over your actions, or that your actions respond to your reasons in the right kind of way, or that you have the right kind of causal control. There's lots of different pictures of free will. And the one I think that people worry about the most in the context of time travel is the one about choice, is about having like alternate options actually open to me. And I do think I understand why that one seems the most counterintuitive in a time travel picture. But as I said before, I think the thing to keep in mind there is those options are open to you. Time just reflects whichever one it was that you chose, right? You might have chosen differently, and if you had, the timeline would have been different.
Lovely, thank you very much. Okay, so an interesting question from Vagas, who says, just curious to know how old is the idea of time travel in human imagination?
That's a good point, a good question. So mostly, generally speaking, people credit H.G. Wells as the Time Machine as like the first time travel story, but I don't know whether that's under a particular sort of Anglo-American idea about time and time travel. So I don't know whether you might find other things that we might call time travel in other stories. I mean, certainly in much older stories about, even in Britain, about people that go into fairyland and time works differently there. So they might be there for 100 years and then come back and only, 2 days have passed or something. There's a sense in which those stories are sort of like time travel stories. So I wouldn't be surprised if these ideas of disparities between how time works somewhere and how time works somewhere else are much, much older. But yeah, the Time Machine is usually credited as the first time travel story in the usual sense.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Steph. So the next question from Donna, she's exploring the differences in magic and fantasy time travel versus science fiction time travel. What views do you have on the strengths and weaknesses and the differences between the two?
That's a lovely question, and not one I've really thought about. So I think I don't think there's a clear-cut distinction between fantasy and sci-fi. I remember interviewing Adrian Tchaikovsky, the novelist, a few years ago, and he said something like, there's peak fantasy and peak sci-fi and a sort of morphospace between them. So I think, nonetheless, I think we can make sense of Donna's question in terms of there being sort of time travel where we don't need as much of an explanation of how the time machine works or exactly what's going on. I think as soon as you introduce magic, people often feel like the rules change, but I don't think it needs to be any less consistent so long as whatever text it is plays by its own rules. Whereas with sci-fi, like hard sci-fi, people try to give some sort of physical or physics-based explanation, so entropy and quantum superpositions. I was watching the new Bill and Ted, and there's lots of chat about that. And I think that can hamstring authors. So actually, I don't think there's a difference in consistency between sci-fi and fantasy time travel simpliciter. But I do think that if you free yourself from the shackles of limited scientific understanding, that people can write philosophically consistent fiction in worlds, fantastic worlds, very different from our own. Does that answer Donna's question? You can let me know, Donna.
Yes, Donna will let us know. Thank you. So another question from Wagas again. You did say in your presentation that you were dealing with philosophical time travel rather than the physics of it. But nevertheless, he says, are you aware of advanced projects or labs working on the physics of time travel?
So there's lots of people. There have been physicists interested in the theoretical possibility of time travel, who I know about. So there are reasons to think that time travel is compatible with special relativity. There are reasons to suspect that time travel is compatible with general relativity, although it's slightly different models of time travel. We haven't quite worked out how to reconcile them. But I don't know anyone building a time machine, if that's what you're asking me. If you know, please tell me. I'd love to be involved.
Lovely. Thank you. Great. Okay, so George is taking that further. He says, what do you think of double slit experiments where past events are apparently charged by current events, or that apparently oppositely charged particles are in fact due to one of them traveling backwards in time? Have you heard about that?
I have. I don't have very many clever things to say about it, but what I would say, the philosophical corresponding idea is the idea of backwards causation. So the idea that so when we talk about causation, we have in mind that causes usually come before their effects. When I switch the light switch on my wall, the light comes on, the cause comes before the effect. However, if time travel were possible, at least under most models of time travel, that's going to involve some backwards causation. So the things I do today might affect things that happened 2 weeks ago. Or if I get punched in the face as I get in my time machine and then a bruise appears on my face in 1920, then the punch in the face in 2021 has caused the bruise in 1920. And so we have models of how backwards causation might work, and philosophers are definitely interested in that. So I think there's nothing logically inconsistent with the idea that what might be going on in some of these experiments is future stuff interacting with past stuff.
Fascinating, thank you. So Jacob says, I'll read his question first and then go on to a remark that he makes. His question is, are there any time travel stories with paradoxes that you enjoy? And he then goes on to say, with regard to time travel media, he's a big champion of Homestuck because he thinks that it uses notions of paradox in a really novel way, and also believes that the first great American novel of the 21st century, but that's neither here nor there.
Okay, so I can't comment on Homestuck, but there are kind of two ways to understand the question. So one is there are definitely texts I enjoy that happen to have paradoxes in them that I like for other reasons. So like I quite enjoy Doctor Who, even though it just plays havoc with time and time travel, but I suspect that's not really true to the spirit of your question, which is, are there texts that do contain paradoxes, but nonetheless, are kind of good and interesting. It's tricky because I find it really hard to separate. I genuinely find it difficult to separate my enjoyment versus for these other reasons with my philosophy brain that's going, that's not right, that's impossible, that's an inconsistent story. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you're asking me, like, I really love the Dragon Age series of games. I love Dragon Age Inquisition. Time travel and it's nonsense. So there is a sense in which the answer is yes, but there is a sense in which the answer is yeah, but not for the time travel.
Lovely, thank you, Steph. Okay, so Donna says, she's talking about other than Bill and Ted. Can you think of a good example of a text that tells a good story, but where the time traveler is aware that time travel is in a static universe? They know that they can't change time, other than Bill and Ted.
Yes, I can think of a couple. So the first is Heinlein's All You Zombies, in which it turns out, and this is a spoiler, sorry, but it's a really old story, so, I'm sorry, in which every character in that story turns out to be a time slice of the same character. So a younger or older version of the same character. And the oldest version, the bartender, knows that they're a time traveler and is deliberately engineering events to recruit themselves into the time traveling agency. And the second is called, in fact, I'm just going to take one sec to run to my other bookshelf on the other wall and grab it and show you it. Is a book called How to Live, I don't know if you can hear me, How to Live Safely in a Science Fiction Universe, which a student of mine lent to me, and then I have never returned, and I feel really bad about it, but I don't know where they are now. So apologies. But in this one, the main character, Charles Yu, is a time machine repairman, so is very much aware that they're in a time travel fiction and uses that accordingly. There are probably others, but those are the two that come to mind immediately.
Thank you very much. Okay, so from John refers to Nolan's latest film that explores inverted time, called Tenet, and he says, where does Tenet fit into your philosophical framework? Having said that, he puts in a disclaimer that he's seen it once, he didn't understand it, and he needs to watch it again.
So I've read the Wikipedia summary, but I haven't seen it because of the pandemic, I was stuck in my house and couldn't go to the cinema. So I haven't seen Tenet yet, but I've read the wiki summary, which is somewhat lacking in detail. And it looks from first read, although no doubt some of the audience can correct me, it looks from first read like it's some kind of loop, some kind of static loop. Rather than being dynamic, it looks like it maybe is a kind of four-dimensional picture, but I will have to, when I watch it, I will tweet about it and let you know. Great,
so follow Steph's tweets. Lovely. So now Chris takes us back to Aristotle and says, what would you say to the Aristotelian claim that he seemed to hold that there was no such thing as either the past or the future in the first place?
So I guess there's a couple of things I would say about Aristotle. So if we take that kind of philosophical picture, which these days we would call, I'm not necessarily crediting this with Aristotle, but if we interpret Aristotle as claiming that that the future and the past don't exist, then that is a theory of time that these days we call presentism, where the present is this moving thing where all the live action happens. The past used to be the present, but isn't any longer, so it doesn't exist, and the future isn't the present yet, so it doesn't exist. There are philosophers who think that time travel is still possible in a presentist universe, and indeed a presentist universe would still be a static picture. It would just be a different kind of static picture where the present is the only bit that is real, but times only happen once. So Keller and Nelson have a paper on this, and they say that you can imagine the time traveler getting in the time machine today, when today is the present, and arriving in 1920 when 1920 was the present. So it's not that that time travel would require the present to be kind of recreated or us to move the present. It would just be the case that when 1920 was the present, the time travel was there. Likewise, if they were going to jump 20 years in the future, they will be at that time when that time is the present. There are some worries about, so I think that works from a kind of consistency perspective. There are some worries about presentist time travel because it's really hard to explain what happens to the time traveler in the intervening time, and what makes the time traveler in 1920 the same person as who left in 2021, because none of the intervening period exists either. Nonetheless, you can tell that kind of consistent story with that kind of picture. The other thing is that Aristotle is famous for his sea battle, for many things, but one of the things he's famous for is the sea battle problem, which ties into this idea of free will. So if it's true now that there'll be a sea battle 100 years from now, is it the case that we can't do anything about the fact that there is a sea battle 100 years from now? And I would make the same sort of response as I did earlier, which is, it might be true that there's a sea battle 100 years from now, but it's true because of the things that happen in the intervening period. It's not the case that there's a sea battle and that somehow fixes everything that leads up to it. That's to get things backwards.
Lovely, thank you very much. Okay, so Vargas has a third question, and again he's taking us to physics, but nevertheless he's just linking it. He's saying, do you think quantum physics and the idea of the multiverse in which the past and the future serve as different universes, can this add a new dimension to the theories and views about time travel?
Yeah, I think it can. I think we can tell a sort of trans-dimensional multiverse story about time travel, depending on how you kind of cash out the multiverse. So I think you could also tell a sort of branching story depending on your picture of the multiverse. So if there are various timelines or various worlds or various versions of the universe, then it could be the case that that your grandfather is killed in one of them but not killed in the other, in the one that you're born in, and that allows for consistency. That's fine. A lot of these scientific models are sort of more concrete specifications of the abstract philosophical models, so we can tell them as like more fleshed out versions of a branching story, or more fleshed out versions of a transdimensional story, or whatever. So yeah, I think the multiverse gives people more meat to use in their time travel stories without necessarily leading to any contradictions.
Fantastic, great. Okay, so from Mike, we have a question regarding philosophers and their attempts to write time travel fiction. He says,
okay.
Are you aware of any philosophers who have attempted to write such time travel fiction, and with what degree of success, in your view?
That's a very good question. And I'm going to feel really bad, because I know most of the time travel philosophers. I'm going to feel really bad if I've forgotten somebody who's written something. So Nick Effingham from Birmingham, I believe when he was young, wrote some fiction. He's a time travel philosopher. I'm not sure whether, or a philosopher of time. I'm not sure whether it was time travel fiction though. So my answer is, I don't know of any off the top of my head. But if I find any, I'll let you know. I certainly, speaking for myself, a big part of why I do what I do is because I'm not creative enough. And this is just limited to me. I'm not tarring all philosophers with the same brush, but I'm definitely not creative enough to write these brand new stories. So my hope is if I can point out all the tropes, if I can point out everything, build a sort of schema of what goes on, that then people can use that to either sort of play with and subvert those tropes, or to really come up with new ones. So not from me, alas.
Alas, indeed. Okay, from Michael. Right, so Michael talks about the fact that there seems to be a difference between narrative coherence and causal chains. And he requests if you could say something about the relevance of the theories of causality to time travel.
Okay, that's a very big question, but I'll do my best. So I think it's right to say that stories get to kind of make up their own rules, and something might be narratively coherent if it obeys those rules, even though we might think that the rules that are at play in that particular story aren't the kinds of rules that would adhere in our world or in worlds suitably like ours. So speaking about causal chains, like theories of free will, there are loads of different theories of causation, and I think those can cross-cut free will. You don't cross-cut time travel. You don't need to have a particular account of causation to think that time travel is possible. But it is the case that weird things do happen causally with time travel. So you can end up with like causal loops. So here's just a really simple, they appear in almost all of the fiction that I mentioned, but here's a sort of a simpler example where a time traveler goes back in time and gives his younger self the blueprints to build a time machine. this is a case from David Lewis, the younger self grows up, uses those blueprints to build a time machine, goes back in time, gives his younger self the blueprint. So where do the blueprints come from? Each of those moments in time only happen once. It's not that people worry that they're caught in a loop. Time doesn't work like that under four-dimensionalism. Each of those times only happen once, but it seems like the blueprints sort of came from nowhere. And also all of the causes and effects in that loop have to match up beautifully to get a consistent story. I think that's less of a worry in fiction. There have been some philosophers like Murray McBeath who have suggested that if we want our fiction to be like reality, we shouldn't have those kind of loops. But I disagree, and I'm not alone in this. Those loops, if they worked, would be coincidental. They're highly improbable, but I don't think there's anything impossible about them. And improbable things happen all the time. When I look outside my window, the particular arrangement of cars parked on the street is, you know, really, really unlikely. But there are so many ways that it could be, and it has to be one of those ways. Likewise, yeah, so I'm not sure that that really fully answers the question, except I would say, yes, I agree that there is a difference between whether you've told a consistent causal story and perhaps a difference between whether you've told a narrative story, but I think there's lots of scope for different causal pictures in time travel.
Thank you. We have a follow-up remark from Donna, who thanks you, Steph, for your answer on fantasy versus science fiction time travel. She has an additional thought, and this is around the amount of control that a time traveler tends to have, and the why it is happening. Do you think it's part of the narrative, part of the fiction?
Oh, that's a good question. So, I mean, so it's true that a lot of time travel stuff is rule of cool or rule of fun. So it might be that that the time traveler knowing exactly what they need to know in order to do the things that they do is perhaps more unlikely, would be more unlikely in real life than it is in the narrative. But I do think there are lots of ramifications, I'm doing work on this at the moment, of knowing stuff about the future. So I think that time travelers are in an unusual position where the more they know, the less they can do, actually. And that if they believe that things are going to happen in a particular way, whether or not those beliefs are accurate, then that constrains what they feel is possible and what the choices that they would make. In the same way as, you know, I wouldn't try and fly off a building because I know some stuff about gravity and about my body and what's likely to happen. Likewise, if a time traveler believes they're in a static universe and believes that they got in their time machine 2 years from now, I wonder whether they'd really be able to bring themselves to feel motivated to prevent themselves from doing that, or killing their grandfather if they know that their grandfather didn't die because, you know, they exist or whatever. So I think there's some ramifications. The short answer then is there are some ramifications of time travelers knowing stuff that I suspect means they're able to do less than our stories often paint them as being able to do. And I think this conceit that if time travelers know what's going on, they suddenly have a lot of control, yeah, is often a fictional conceit, but I don't think an impossible one. Again, just an improbable one.
Thank you, Steph. So we have a question from Jazz, who is talking about the possibility of escaping death. So he says, what are your ideas of time traveling past the date of your death? Do you think it would create a paradox, or would it be a way of escaping death?
Okay, so that's a good question. I don't think there's a problem with time traveling past the point of your death, but I don't think it's a way of escaping death. And this is how. I think it's helpful if we think about two different ways we might conceive of time. So there is time for the time traveler, measured by their wristwatch or the aging of their cells, and there is time, external time as we know it, right? So like that 1921 comes after 1920. And generally speaking, ordinary people's personal time and external time match up, right? As a second goes by in external time, so too they experience a second in personal time. A time traveler gets to experience things a bit out of order, but presumably, unless the time machine is doing extra stuff, they keep aging at the normal rate. So maybe their first year is 1990 and their second year is 1920, as opposed to everybody else's first year being 1990 and their second year being 1991. But they're still going to last as much time in personal time as they were going to otherwise. So while in external time, somebody could visit after their death, so if they die in 2050. They could get in a time machine when they're 30 years old and visit 2100. If their body is going to last till about 80, then they're going to get about 80 personal years of time travel regardless. So I don't think it's a way of escaping death. I do, however, think there is this interesting way that one might use time travel, or at least it's been suggested that one might use time travel, that might make one feel immortal. And we see this in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, one of the later books, where Arthur Dent meets a time traveler who tries to kill him. But the time traveler, the bat creature, mentions that he had previously seen him at a different place. And Arthur Dent knows he hasn't been to that place yet. So he thinks he's immortal until he gets to that place. Given that he knows that at some time in the future he will get to that place, he knows that he doesn't die in the intervening period. And so you might think, well, if I traveled forward in time and found out when I died, then in the meantime, I can do all sorts of risky stuff. I can dive off cliffs, or I can, and there are things that we can say about that. What I would say, though, is it's extremely unlikely, but improbable things happen. It's extremely unlikely that someone who, upon hearing when they die, would jump off a bunch of cliffs, would hear accurately that they live until they're, 100. That is an unlikely series of events happening together, but unlikely things happen.
Thank you, that's great. Okay, I've noticed that our next speaker has come in, but we've still got plenty of time, another 10, 12 minutes or so for Q&A, and they keep rushing in.
I take that as a good sign. That's a
very good sign indeed. Okay, so I apologize in advance. We may not be able to get through to all the questions, but Steph will do as much justice as she can to them. So another question from Hannes, our host. He asks, what do you think of the theories of duration, e.g. Bergson, and how might this align with time travel possibilities? Do you think this is just an example of the growing block theory?
I'm not sure I really understand the question. Maybe the question could you just read it for me again?
Okay, sure. Hannes, you're online. Would you like to unmute yourself and clarify?
Apologies. I was asking a question about the French philosopher Henri Bergson and his theory of duration, where he understands sort of all of the past causing a kind of a permanent influence on the present moment. As a method to kind of understand certain concepts like free will, but this might just take us in a radical tangent, so it might be worth just skipping the question and moving on to the next one. Apologies.
I'm really sorry I can't answer it. I'm not familiar with Bergson's work, so my French philosophy is weak. I'm terribly sorry. But if I read about it and I have something interesting to say, I will drop you an email.
Okay, please do. Thank you.
Great. Back to science fiction time travel. From Franco, he asks, have you watched Dark? Was there an innovative philosophy of time?
I haven't yet, but I've just been asked to review a paper that talks about Dark. So I'm going to have to watch it. So yeah, no, I haven't yet, but I'm very excited, and people tell me that I would like it and find it interesting. So yay to life returning to normal and me having time to watch TV.
Okay, so the questions are coming so fast. I'm just trying to read this one quickly. From Donna. Donna says, have you read the first 15 Lives of Harry August by Claire North? If so, what do you think of that as a different way of exploring some of the philosophical ideas usually explored through time travel? That is, it is about reliving one's own life again and again differently.
Yes, I have read it. So the first 15 Lives of Harry August, it was a few years ago that I read it, but the idea is that certain characters in the world relive their lives over and over and over again. I think you can conceive it as a kind of mental time travel. So they retain all the memories of their previous lives. I think a way to read it as being consistent would be some sort of branch model. So each time they go back, a new branch develops, which allows them to use the knowledge they have to make things come about differently. I think that's that works fine as a consistent model. One thing that does kind of worry me about these branching models, and I think I alluded to it in the talk, is that if what you're trying to do is make the world better, then making some other branch better might not feel fully satisfying. Might not feel like, you're really saving all the people you want to save, or that you're, bringing the world about. And maybe it's just better to have one good branch than only have a single line that is a bit bad. But yeah, I do have this sort of lingering concern about those. But yeah, I really enjoyed the first 15 Lives of Harry August. I thought it was a really interesting book.
Great reference to this time to Interstellar and the time travel represented in that, and from Ben, and he says, great talk, thanks.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Ben, that's great. Yeah, Interstellar gets the seal of approval, except for, and this has nothing to do with time travel, except for where they have Anne Hathaway's, up until then, very pragmatic character give a nonsense speech about the importance of love. But other than that, Interstellar does really interesting static stuff. So you see clues at the beginning that you then see the future characters, the future versions of the characters creating. So Interstellar has a 5-dimensional picture, so the 3 spatial dimensions plus a temporal dimension plus gravity, they say, is the 5th dimension. But from a time travel perspective, yeah, Interstellar works nicely and has a nice loop.
Fabulous. Okay, question from John, who says, if you could recommend one David Lewis book for a beginner, what would it be?
Oh, I would recommend a paper rather than a book. So my favorite philosophy paper of all time is his 1976, The Paradoxes of Time Travel. It's about, well, depending on the version, about 10 pages long, and it is super dense in that there's lots of content, but it's wonderfully clear. And I just really love how Lewis writes. So, but if you wanted to read more, he has a paper called like Schrodinger's Lives or something like that. But you can buy volumes of his philosophy papers, and I think that's a nicer way to get to grips with Lewis than reading the books, because books like Counterfactuals are great but are heavy. In fact,
does he or do any of the others, do they link this with Schrodinger's cat?
Yeah, so David Lewis has this paper on, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's about Schrodinger, and it's about how I kind of don't want to spoil it because it's such a good read, but it's about how we could be really worse off if the multiverse was the right kind of picture. Then all the worlds in which we survive, there are lots of ways to survive badly, right? Essentially. So if you're doing something and the choice is between, jumping off a cliff and you die versus jumping off a cliff and you live, you could have jumped off the cliff and lived and have really badly broken bones and not be able to walk, or have there's lots of really bad versions of the world in which you survive. But it's a really, really nice paper. So yeah, he does that. There are lots of philosophers of physics who talk about Schrodinger. The people that I know that speak about kind of time and speak about physics, people like Alistair Richmond in Edinburgh, Nick Effingham in Birmingham, Al Wilson in Birmingham, and there are others. So yeah, yes, there are definitely people that speak about Schrodinger.
Lovely, great. So I haven't seen any more questions coming in. If there is nothing, so there's one more, okay, from John. Presumably the text is, how many lives has Schrodinger's cat?
Yes, that's the one.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I should be Googling as I answer questions, but I'm frightened I'll lose my Zoom window.
Fabulous, because other people can be Googling it on your video.
Yeah. Yes, that's the paper.
Great, great. Thank you, John. Okay, so we've reached the end of our questions, and you've answered them so ably. If it's okay with you, shall we take an earlier break?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you very much.
If I could thank our speaker, Steph, it's been truly fascinating. You've taken us on a journey into sort of metaphysics and pop culture and the intersection. And I think all of us will be reading more and watching more of science fiction and time travel.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. And if you find anything, if you see anything great, or if you have further questions, please do get in touch. I'm eminently contactable, and I'm always happy to talk about time travel.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And you've received lots of thanks from our members, the attendees, who say thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed the talk, and all the best for all the interesting research work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind, all of you. And I wish you all the best in these very interesting times.